This is the fourth talk of the Winter Speakers Series 2022, and thank you all for attending. My name is Park Davis. I'm going to be your host again tonight, your MC. As a recap, there's 8 more talks to go, one every Wednesday from now until April 6th. And the full listing of the talks with their titles and a bit of information about each talk is on the website, so you can have a look at that. One additional item, if you miss any of them or if you want to check on something later, all the talks are going to be recorded, so you'll be able to go back and pick those up by checking the NSC website. In terms of a lead-in, this is the 16th year for these talks with the objectives of getting sailors together in the winter and also raising donations for the Legacy Fund. The talks are free, but this year, because we're online and we were able to do it, we've set up a donation system provided through the Eventbrite function. I want to thank everybody that's already donated to our work in the Legacy Fund. As noted in the lead-in to this, we've raised over $800 already this year. So I think we should give everybody a pat on the back for that, to raising money towards our goal. One additional thing that's sort of off topic perhaps, but I'm just going to, we're all used to seeing, let's see, these sorts of hats. Let's see if I can get them on camera. Oh, there we go. Turn it right side round, perhaps. That might be better. No, not doing too well here. Oh, there, finally. So we've got ball caps as of a few days ago in regalia at NSC. We also have toques, which again, I'm not doing very justice to them. But there's blue toques, and there's also black toques, and there's also red toques, I understand. So anybody that's interested in getting something like that, more fitting to the season, they're available in NSC Regalia right now. So back on topic, introductions. The talks are organized by 3 of us. Tony Wright does all the web work and publicizes the talks. And he's also become our Zoom master and our Eventbrite master as well. So he's done all of that. Stephen Kidd works with scheduling and finding speakers, and also behind the scenes, working with Tony every Wednesday, including tonight. He's also spelled me off from time to time being MC, and he's going to be doing that in the future as well. So just to make Stephen's life a little bit easier, one of his tasks is finding speakers. And so if you know somebody that is interested in talking about an experience they've had, something that's related to sailing, please contact any one of us and we'll see if we can schedule you. So don't be bashful, please come ahead. And last, I'm Park Davis again, and I take care of the MC duties. Okay, so about a little over 3/4 of us are from the Nepean Sailing Club, some from other clubs on the river, some from not on any club, and other spots. So it's always interesting to find out who we're reaching with these talks. So I'll ask Tony to close that. Thank you. An ad for next week's talk. Next week, we're going to have Vicki Hogan-Gow, and she's going to be here to talk about keeping your sails young with good care and maintenance. And I believe Vicki is also available for those of us that sometimes race and sometimes have difficulties with our sails after a race or during a race. So perhaps you can get her contact information next week and hear about how to keep your sails young at the same time. So before we talk about tonight's presentation, different from last week, I'd like you to use the Q&A icon or the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for all the questions. And what we'll do is take your written questions using the Q&A function, and then we'll get them all at the end of the screen and go through them one by one by one. So the title of the presentation tonight is Sailing Uphill, and it's a transatlantic adventure. So how we're going to put those two pieces together, I'm not quite sure yet. That's Paul Pearl's talk. Paul's going to tell us about leaving Florida in May 1989 with 3 friends bound for Europe, and how over the next 6 months, still aboard his boat, Paul was almost 1,000 feet above sea level, and then how he scooted across France from the south to the north in 3 days flat. This is his story. Paul's an Australian by birth, and he learned to sail, first of all, just by reading. And then, of course, he had all sorts of experience since then. And since then, he's chartered in Europe, in Canada, and the US. And I guess like many of us, he's a serial boat owner, starting with his first dinghy back just before NSC was established in 1979, and continuing since then. He now races cats at NSC. So I'm going to turn things over. You're just on air, Paul. I'm going to turn things over to you. So thank you very much.
Hi, folks. Also, maybe I should say good day, folks. Yes, okay. I think I've got everything operating correctly, so we'll move on. This is my talk. First, I want to start with a disclaimer. This trip that I'm going to describe took place 23 years ago. That's a long time ago for me. I can't remember what I was doing last week, let alone 23 years ago. So I've managed to put this together from some old photographs that we made of this trip. But memories and facts do fade. So don't think that everything that I say is absolutely true. Second, I've tried to make this presentation out of what I call a boat's eye perspective. We made thousands of photos or hundreds of photos on this trip, but I wanted specifically in this talk to look at the trip, as it were, from a boat's eye perspective. There are some special exceptions, things that happened to us on the trip, which are really worthy of mention and not specifically about boats. Okay, to start with a map, strange looking map. The trip started in Ottawa, and you'll see this is just a forward look. We drove down to Fort Lauderdale where we picked up our boat, then sailed the boat around to Cape Coral, where for a month I worked on preparing the boat in a harbour there, and actually the place where the boat was actually built. Then we sailed across the Atlantic, stopping in Bermuda and Horta in the Azores, finally landfall in Seville, and through the Mediterranean to Set. That is the first part of the trip, and that's the part that I'll describe now. Okay, it was April 1989. I was fortuitously between jobs, not necessarily my choice, but it was opportune. And we piled a lot of stuff into a U-Haul trailer. And we just started off by driving down to Fort Lauderdale to see our boat. We'd never seen the boat before. The boat was purchased through an agent who was a sailor himself. So we bought it sight unseen. And this is the first view of the boat that we had in Fort Lauderdale. I want to say a few things about this choice of boats. First of all, I should point out that I know this photo is the first time we ever saw the boat because it's the only time I had winch covers on it. I don't know if I ever saw the boat with winch covers again. We were looking for a center cockpit boat for comfort's sake, but we did not want to have a high center cockpit for reasons of sailing through rough seas where it can get very uncomfortable. The other thing that we needed with this boat was a fairly shallow draft. I think if I remember correctly, this boat had a drop keel on it. The drop keel was quite deep. I believe it was a lead keel which went down 9 feet, if I remember correctly, but it could be cranked up, leaving a short stubby keel, a built-in keel of about 3 feet or somewhat less than 3 feet, if I remember correctly. The boat was a 43-foot length, and it was called a Brewer 43, and it was built in Florida, where I actually did some work on it, but I believe it was based on a Canadian boat called a Whitby. I'm not absolutely certain of that, but I just thought I'd put it in here. The boat was called the Happy Prince. That's a long story as to why it was called the Happy Prince, something to do with my childhood, something to do with Oscar Wilde, but I won't go into that now. Below decks, the boat was fairly standard. I thought I'd put in a couple of pictures here just to show you the forecastle, the aft cabin, the head, and the saloon. Nothing particularly outstanding. It was nice to have 2 completely separate cabins. Okay, so more specifically about our route across the Atlantic. We left from Cape Coral, which it's a bit difficult to see on this chart. This is the actual, this is a picture of the chart that I actually photographed. I kept the chart, the actual chart that we marked up as we crossed the Atlantic. And this is a photo of it. It's rather hard to see exactly what it's showing, but I can point out a few things. We left from the west coast of Florida, Cape Coral, through Miami, literally through the middle of Miami and through the Bahamas at night. And it took us 7 days to get to Bermuda, which is here. From Bermuda, the sailing directions we had at Bermuda was to head north until we hit the westerlies or we hit 40 degrees north. Or 41 degrees north, I believe it was. At 40 degrees north, we hit the westerlies and we turned. And you can just make out some of the marks. We turned towards the Azores, which I understand was a good move because some people who were sailing near us went slightly further north than we did, only 1 degree further north before they turned to the right. And they hit some very bad weather. For us, the crossing was the opposite. We were struggling from lack of wind for most of the time. Not all of the time. A couple of days we had 35 knots, but we were comfortable, and our biggest problem going across was lack of wind. I'll talk about that again in a moment. On this chart, you can see pencil marks. These are the sightings we took at midday every day. And you can see that's just 24 hours movement from here to there, 24 hours, etc., etc. Here are the Azores, and then it was straight into Seville, which is slightly inland, but I'll talk about that later. I just want to point out that this was all being done pre-GPS. We had a navigation system which wasn't very reliable, called SatNav, which didn't work very well in the middle of the Atlantic, and it wasn't terribly accurate when it did work. and we were more reliant on sextant than anything else as our navigation instruments. That's me, believe it or not, 33 years ago. Just a few little stories as we crossed, nothing's very dramatic, just a picture of Horta, the lava flows in Horta. That's a lava flow from some time ago. I just made a little note to myself here about a British saga that happened to us in Horta, not to us, but to somebody else. We met a 28-foot boat when we arrived in Horta, sailing boat, without a mast. And as I was getting off our boat, I saw somebody working on a galvanized pipe, water pipe. And I asked them what they were doing. And they said they were making a mast for this boat that had sailed across the same as us from Florida, had arrived in Horta, had been dismasted by some rather strange accident, which I won't go into now, and that they could not get a new mast. And so they were building a mast out of galvanized iron pipe. I thought to myself, they'll never do it. Their home base was in Gibraltar, and weeks later, sure enough, we met them in Gibraltar. So they did do it, and they did sail the rest of the way with a mast made out of galvanized pipes. The other little anecdote I want to tell you about is our arrival in Bermuda. This is actually back to front. Bermuda should have come before the Azores. But in Bermuda, as we sailed in, we passed a Canadian naval tug leaving just as we were arriving. We waved to them because we were sailing under a Canadian flag. And we got to the dock and people were very rude to us. And we said, what's going on? What did we do? And apparently they told us that this Canadian tug had sailed right through the middle of a race. They have Bermudas, I think they're 18 footers that race every Saturday, and it swamped half of the fleet. So we were, I guess, held partially responsible, being Canadian. The second thing worth mentioning about Bermuda is we left Bermuda very late at night, and we'd only gone about 2 hours when our sat-nav failed, the navigation aid. A big debate about whether we should turn back or not. In the end, we turned back, came in at early hours of the morning, which was quite hazardous. As many of you know, Bermuda is surrounded by reefs. Got the sat-nav repaired and left the day after. So that was just something that happened to us. There are certain challenges out there in the middle of the Atlantic. I just summarized them here. Occasionally we had good waves, and I think our maximum I measured was 35 feet, but these were big rollers, and I found them a bit intimidating at the beginning, but after a while they were very, very easy to handle, and much easier than the chop we were to experience much later in the Mediterranean. Running out of fuel was always a problem. We carried extra fuel aboard, and we adopted especially the section between the Bermuda and the Azores, which took us 27 days, I think that's right, something like that. And we crept into the Azores late at night, of course, into Horta, with literally the last bit of fuel we had. The boat was a bit too big to handle in cramped areas under sail, so we had to motor in, and on top of that, we had to motor every day for at least an hour to keep our freezer operating, which was operated by the fan belt from the motor. We crept into the Azores on the last whiff diesel. We tied up in the middle of the night to something we didn't know what it was. It turned out to be a huge buoy when the sun rose in the morning, and we did not actually have enough fuel to get from the buoy to the docking point, but we managed it anyhow. And anybody who has sailed any boat at all, sailboat, knows that repairing the head is the worst possible job you ever have to do. And I don't wish that on anybody, but I certainly had to do it a number of times. Okay, now we're just, I'll show you on a map where we're going. We came across the Atlantic, stopping at the first stop. We were meant to stop in a port in Portugal here, but we passed that point at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we decided it just wasn't worth it to wait, hang around before we could go in. So we carried on to Seville, and Seville is actually not on the coast. It's up a river. It's quite a far up a river, the Guadalquivir there, and we actually just made it. We had to motor up that river. It's a major river, and we just made it to Seville before the one and only lock in Seville closed. It's a lock which opens and closes once. It opens once in the morning and closes once in the night. And if you're on the river and you don't make it to the nighttime closing, you're stuck because you can't stop in the river. I don't know what you would do. We just made it in time. And from Seville, we stayed there while our crew changed, as it were. The guys who came across the Atlantic with me left as was planned, and I was joined by my daughters and my wife. And from there on, we sailed the rest of the trip, as you'll see. From Seville, we went through Gibraltar and a couple of ports along the Spanish coast, eventually to Ibiza. We had holidayed many times before, and we were very interested to see what it looks like. To Palma, and eventually to a small port on this, very close to the Spanish-French border, but in France, and eventually ending our blue water sailing, as it were, in a port not far from Montpellier in France called Sète. And I'll be describing some of these as I go along further. Just two points I wanted to point out. We had 2 battles on our hands as we made that route. One battle was in Seville. When we arrived in Seville late at night, we were ushered into this dock, into this up behind a large Russian freighter, into this lock behind a large Russian freighter that was in ballast, so most of it was out of the water. We were right behind the propeller, and the propeller was half out of the water. This lock was in very, very bad shape, and there was literally nothing to tie onto. And we had no idea what was going on. We were told just stop here behind this huge Russian freighter and wait. The lock gates closed behind us. It was dark. And then all of a sudden, without any warning, the water did not rise noticeably. I believe it actually rose about 2 or 3 inches, that's all. And unbeknownst to us, the lock gates at the front of the lock had opened. Our first indication that something was going on was when the propeller in front of us started to turn. It was huge. The wash was fantastic. We were only 10 feet away, and it brushed us up like a matchstick against the wall. Fortunately, there were a few reinforced rebars sticking out from the concrete, which we could grab hold of. And if it wouldn't have been for that, I have no idea what would have happened. Anyhow, that was the first battle. The second battle was nothing to do with us. Just at this point here, where you can see that red mark, suddenly somebody said, you know what? We're right over where the Battle of Trafalgar took place. And sure enough, it was exactly that spot where the Battle of Trafalgar took place. What we all commented on was how shallow the water was there. I believe it was only 20 feet or 15 feet deep, or something like that. And we wondered how they managed in those days. Anyhow, so much for that. Okay, in Gibraltar, as I said before, we met the people who had had the trouble in the Azores, much to our surprise. They had taken much longer than us to get across. We had stopped for quite a while in Seville, but there they were, as cocky as anywhere. The other thing I wanted to point out here is when we bought the boat, there was no radar on it. I installed radar on it in Cape Coral, and that was a real lifesaver. For example, when we were approaching the river to Seville in the Gulf of Cadiz, it was extremely foggy. You could barely see the front of the boat. And the radar picked up the buoys showing us the entrance to the river. It was dead easy to come right up the river like that. Without that radar, I don't think we could have made it. So I just thought I'd point that out. So here's to prove that we were actually in Gibraltar. Some of the passages were fairly rough, particularly in the Mediterranean. I point this out because most people think it's the Atlantic which is rough, and I'm sure it can be. But I found personally, our experience was sailing in the Mediterranean was a much more challenging experience than sailing out in the Atlantic. It's not just, it wasn't so much rough, but changeable, incredibly changeable. And I think where this particular photo was taken, I don't remember which direction, I think we were on a close haul. And let's say we were close haul going east, I presume. And there was a boat only 100 yards or 200 yards away from us on close haul going in exactly the opposite direction. So the Mediterranean, being surrounded by mountains all around, tends to get very, very changeable and some very great, a lot of chop, enormous amount of chop. This picture here is just shows us coming closer to Ibiza. And here's me roughing it in Malaga. That's the car I wanted, but I couldn't afford. A couple of spots we stopped at that's worth pointing out. This is called Perpetus. It's a castle on the way that not far from the coast. We hired a car actually to go and visit it. I thought I'd point this out because it's one of the most dramatic sites in southwestern France that you'll ever see. It's really, really dramatic. If you ever get a chance to visit that, go there. Okay, so we'd arrived in Sète, and from Sète, we're going to go inland. And just a look ahead, Sète, we're going to go uphill through Lyon, and then all the way up here to the highest spot. And then we're going to start going downhill to Strasbourg. And then for reasons I'll explain, we're going to turn around and go downhill now all the way through to Nancy and to Lyon and eventually to Valence back again. So the next part of my talk is going to talk about all of that trip. So basically you're crossing approximately half France, there, back and forth. So getting ready to go inland. This is the port of Set. And the first thing we obviously had to do was to take down the mast, which you can see being done then. And the mast was actually stored in a warehouse in Set, because at that time we thought we'd be returning to Set. As it happens, we did not, and you'll hear about what happened with our mast later on. We took our bikes with us from Ottawa. They were stored on the boat underneath the cockpit. And here's me getting the bike out for the first time in Set, ready to go biking around. They were terrific to have the bikes on the trip. We used them a lot. We actually brought them all the way back to Ottawa and used them in Ottawa for a few years after this trip. So the very first part of the trip, I'll be showing detailed maps of every part of the trip. So starting in Set, which as you can see, well, you can't see it here, is somewhat to the west of Marseille, which is just off the map here, just to put this in order. We went through the canals to the Rhone, which is here, and then up the Rhone all the way to Avignon and beyond. So this section here, I'll be talking from Set to Avignon. Set is quite an incredible place. First thing I wanted to point out is, and this was complete coincidence, we'd come into Set and we tied up where we were shown to go, and we got off the boat, and within 10 meters of where we tied up, there was this plaque on the wall, which I thought was quite incredible, a coincidence for us, as we're Jewish anyhow. And this is apparently the very spot where the ship, the Exodus, in 1947, left with refugees for Israel. And it's where the book and the film, The Exodus, that's the Exodus that they're talking about, the ship, the Exodus. It was a complete coincidence. We had no idea where we were tying up, and that's what was there. The other thing I wanted to point out is the canal that goes from Set to the Rhone is an extension of a canal called Canal du Midi, and it actually crosses lagoons, seawater lagoons. And it's quite incredible how it actually mattered. Now, this is a photo from a long time ago, 33 years ago at least. So I'm not sure what it looks like today. It may not look the same, but that's how it looked at that time. So we were to go right up the middle of this all the way as the start of our trip inland. One of the places we passed was a place called Aigues-Mortes. It's an old port that it's the last port where you can actually originally get access to the sea. We were to come in, we were to come in along here, through here, sorry, the other way, along here, through here, and onwards through there. This is the same spot. You can see, and you can see pleasure boats, and the Mediterranean is at the background here. In years gone by, people told us that the Mediterranean came up to the walls of the city. Apparently that wasn't true. We were to find out much later, but there had been a seawater lake here, which was accessed by the sea, and you could get there in the 11th and 12th century, which is when this town was actually built or started. And so even though there's no seawater anywhere close to this town now, in years gone by, there actually was. And now we were arriving in Arles, off the narrow canal onto the wide Rhone. And Arles was the first port on the Rhone, or the first city on the Rhone that we were to pass as we started heading north. we had an experience in Arles. We decided that we'd go to a bullfight. We were told that unlike the bullfights in Spain, in southern France, they do not kill the bull. Well, the one we went to was the other way around. The bull won. And actually, the bullfighter, who was very famous, apparently French bullfighter, was, as it says here in the newspaper, badly injured and in fact died shortly after. Not something I would like to do again. Okay, now we're getting somewhere where you can dance on the bridge. We're going up the Rhone and we're passing the bridge that you can dance on, sur le pont d'Avignon. So from Avignon, we moved through up the Rhone, through Valence, which is here, and moving up to the major city, Lyon. And the next few slides will talk about that. Now, here we're starting to meet appreciable traffic on the river. This is a commercial river, many large barges. Now, at the time, I don't recall ever seeing large passenger boats, but I'm sure there are right now, but I don't actually recall them. I'm pretty sure we didn't see large cruising boats, and many, many smaller boats of all sorts, sailing boats. You can take a sailing boat from anywhere up to Valence, all the way down to the sea, and still have your mast up and have a deep keel. So these are one of the ports on between Avignon and Lyon, or Valence. It would have been between Avignon and Valence. Many large sailing boats and lots of traffic, commercial traffic. This is typical of the ports on the river in this area. Here you can actually see our boat. It's a bit hard to make out. You can always tell because it's got the little red dinghy on the back of it, which we swung on davits all the way up through our trip. It made an excellent bumper. It was a blow-up boat, and it was indispensable on the way up too. So this is what a port looks like on the river. I should point out that much later, when we were to come down the river, we came down, what would have been 4 months later, and the weather had been bad. There'd been a lot of rain, and the river was in semi-flood. It wasn't in flood, but the current was strong. And we were coming down the river, obviously under motor, but the current was so strong going down the river, which is this direction. So we were coming from here, and this, I say, is much later, not when this photo was taken, that we could not make headway upriver. So if we missed the port as we went going by here, there's no way we could have made it back to the port. We would have had to go back down the river to the next port, which was quite a long way. So that was a challenge we had later on as we came down the river. Now we were to meet our first large locks, and these were giant. They were relatively small compared to the locks we were to see much later on the Rhine, but to give you an idea, and they're so high and they're made for much larger boats than us. So there literally is often nothing to tie onto. So you're scrambling to tie onto things, and even though you have fenders all along the boat, we had rubber tires all along the boat, you still need a bit of manual labor to keep yourself from swinging against the walls of the lock. Some of the entertainment on the way up is jousting in boats. This is a popular sport on the Rhone around Valence in the middle sections. You can see two boats here. It's a bit hard to make out. Platform at the back of the boat. One jouster is here. The other one is there on the other boat on behind. And their objective is to try to knock each other off with their lances. And you can see the lances. Quite something to see when you first see it. We passed some nuclear power stations. As many of you know, France is highly reliant on nuclear power to this day. And this is one of them. I thought that might be interesting. Obviously, very close to the river for cooling purposes. And now we've arrived in Lyon, which is a large city. One of the great pleasures of arriving in Lyon, which is quite an industrial city at its outskirts, is that you arrive on the river and you don't see much of the industry at all. And here we are on this photograph here, right in the middle of Lyon. This square here is the central square of Lyon, called Place Bellecour. And this is us here. And here's a larger photo of the same spot. This is typical of tying up on the side of the river. I don't think you could do this today. In those days, it was all still rather novel and unofficial. And you just grab the spot if you could and just wait until somebody told you can't stop here. And very rarely did that happen. Most of the time you would inquire about where you could, from the locals, you would inquire from the locals as to where you could stop the next night. And they would say, oh, you could stop in place X, but be careful, they're all crooks there. They'll cheat you. We had that every night. They told us the people up the river, don't trust them. They're all crooks. We never had any problems of any sort with any crooks. People were, on the whole, really, really pleasant. In Lyon, we were perfectly placed. That's why I say location, 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 because just up here on the embankment at the top of these stairs was one of the best food markets, fresh food markets that you could find anywhere in the world. And that's how far we had to go to get our supplies. We had two little incidents worth reporting in Lyon. One of them I found quite incredible. This one on the left-hand side is a notice we saw. It wasn't the only notice of this type that we saw in a shop window. At the time, this was 1989, they were celebrating the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, 200 years ago. And you can see here that there were quite a few people who were really objected to this celebration, saying that the people who are celebrating are just the accomplices of pillagers and assassins of 1789. So the French sure have a long memory. This guy here is another story from Lyon. Is a chef in quite a posh restaurant at work, and we were watching him through an open window. And he could see, and it was at ground level, and we were just outside the window. We asked him whether he minded us watching him, and he said, "No, I don't mind. You're welcome." And he started making canards aux oranges for 5 people. And we thought, that's strange, but he kept working. And when he'd finished, he took 4 plates and gave them to the waiter, who took them into the restaurant. And the 5th plate he gave to us, just like that, and said, enjoy. So there you go. I thought that was absolutely lovely. Okay, moving along, we're leaving Lyon now, and we're going up the Saône River, which is a tributary to the Rhone. And then we cross through canals, through a city called Besançon, and eventually arriving at the Rhine River, somewhere around here. and then up the Rhine all the way to Strasbourg. Along this route, we reach our highest point, which is around here. More about that coming up soon. This is our first view of a small canal off in northern France or central France. This is the gateway from the Saône River into the canal going to the Rhine. It looks very small, but in fact, large commercial barges go through this gate into the canal system, which is behind this gate. This is typical of the locks that were on the river, on the canals. Some of these systems were canalized rivers, small rivers. Often they were pure canals. Sometimes we were able to moor the boat for the night in the locks. Sometimes we weren't. It sort of varied. Some of the locks were manned, some of them weren't. There was no traffic on any of these canals in the night. So once the sun set, you were free more or less to moor anywhere you liked. But it was very comfortable if you could moor actually in a lock. So this was a funny incident that happened in the lock. We were going up here, so the water was rising, and one of our mooring lines had been tied at the bottom, and we'd forgot to untie it. So here's me leaning over, trying to reach the bottom of the line to untie it. I was able to, but just able to untie it. So as I mentioned before, some of the barges that come through these locks are really, really tight fit. And you can see this is getting a fairly mountainous area. This is the Vosges Mountains. And you don't pass, you have to be very careful. These guys have right of way, no matter where they're going. So you have to be sure that you can get out of their way. It wasn't a real problem. Some of the canals, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Some of the canals actually go over other canals or other rivers. So down here, there's actually a roadway and a railway underneath this, and you can see a boat ahead of us going through this canal. Most of the traffic in this area were pleasure boats, but there was still a lot of commercial boats. Now we're on the way up, and this is a staircase of locks, not dissimilar to what we have in Ottawa, but far more of them. I think there were 13 or 14, something like this, I can't remember, locks, and each one, I think it took us over half a day to get through all of these locks. A whole day, I'm being told. A whole day to get through these locks on the way up. And here's our highest point. We're now, I looked this up, we're actually 1,200 feet above sea level at this point. That's the Happy Prince here with the red dinghy on the back on davits. And now, not far after this was the way down. And this is quite an engineering structure. The boats go into what looks like a large bath. This here is at the top. And then the whole contraption, this whole contraption bath goes down here on rails, sidewards, and then comes to the bottom, and this opens and you sail out here. Quite something. So that was, I believe, almost the same height as the 14 or whatever it was locks that we passed through before. But at least this time we're on the way down towards the Rhone. The Rhine. You're going through quite mountainous area here. It's feels strange. And you can see here that it's steep banks and narrow. These canals are quite old. Many of them date from the 16th and 17th century. Many of them were let go into disrepair. And I believe since we sailed in 1989, many of them have been restored. In particular, a canal which you can now go from the Rhine system to the Danube system. There was a canal that was built in the 16th century that had fallen into disrepair, and I believe it was restored sometime 10, 20 years ago after we'd done this trip, and now you can go from the Rhine to the Danube system through this canal. But this is not this canal, through a canal. Some of the canals go through underneath, valley, through tunnels, and more about that later in a moment, I think. Yes, there's a town on the way called Besançon. By the way, I apologize to francophones there that I didn't use the accent on the French names, but couldn't work out how to do that. One of the tunnels goes right under Besançon. It's quite narrow, very badly lit, and it goes for about 2 or 3 or 4 kilometers, quite some distance. It takes well over half an hour to get through, under power, obviously. And it's quite narrow, and trying to get a sailing boat hull through that canal, and they never really point that well. They don't respond to the tiller quite the way you would like them, or to the wheel. It was quite a challenge. And the lighting was such that it was quite mesmerizing. And you can see me here sweating. You can see here sweating as I try to guide the boat through the canal. Some of the countryside here was incredibly pretty, postcard pretty. This is a small town called Luxembourg in Alsace. Another town, I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, and they were just glorious little places. Just to prove that this wasn't a postcard, here's the same spot with us actually there in front of the town hall, I think it was. And you can see how hilly this area is. Okay, now we'd come through to the Rhine. And if we thought the Rhone locks were big, the Rhine locks were huge. And of course, these locks are used by much larger barges. And you can see here, we're tied up next to one of these very, very large barges. And these barges ply all the way, they go all the way to Amsterdam. And I think they even go into the North Sea. I'm not sure about that. And there's a lot of commercial traffic up the Rhine. To give you a feel for how big these locks are, here's a boat waiting to go up on the way up. Yeah. So now we've gone up the Rhine and we'd made it to our furthest spot, which was Strasbourg, beautiful city on the Rhine. Interestingly enough, even though you can see us, this is our boat here, and that's our anchor. We actually went through the canals and through the river system in Strasbourg, but we were not allowed to actually moor or tie up or dock in Strasbourg. We had to cross the river to Germany, and we actually stayed on the German side of the Rhine, opposite Strasbourg. But we could come in and tie up just for the day and walk around Strasbourg and have a look and enjoy the sights in Strasbourg. Okay, now when we'd passed through Lyon on the way up, we had already decided that the way this boat trip was going to finish is the boat was going to be going back to North America, to the United States, and be sold in the United States, because we'd mortgaged the house to buy this boat. So when we finished, we had to sell the boat to get out from under our mortgage. When we left originally from Florida, we had no fixed plan about how we were to finish this trip. And I thought that either I would sell the boat in Europe or I would sail it back to North America and sell it there. When we were in Palma in the Mediterranean, we inquired about the possibilities of selling an American boat in Europe, and we were strongly advised not to even try it, that you'll never sell it. People have different tastes, they did then, and there'll be no market for an American boat in Europe. So we were more or less decided that we thought we might sail it back. Then we were told that this was a bad plan because we will be sailing back at the beginning of winter into the Caribbean, and you'd have to leave the boat in the Caribbean. And again, in those days, we were advised not to do this. So our only option was to ship the boat back to North America, which is what we finally did. So on our way up through Lyon was the first place where we could actually make forward plans to have the boat shipped back to North America. And I spoke to a forwarding agent in Lyon who actually was a sailor, a good sailor, and he said, no problems. When you come back to Lyon, on the way back from Strasbourg, we will, you can keep going and down to Marseille, and we'll put your boat in a container and it'll ship back to Baltimore, where it was going to go to. Great. And he said, just when you come back, just let us know when you pass through Lyon, and we'll have everything arranged for you by the time you get down to Marseille. That's not exactly what happened, as you're about to hear. So from Strasbourg, we went west to, my cursor's disappearing. Oh, here it is. To Nancy, and then through the canal system, back to the Saône, and all the way back to Lyon. The canal, autumn was coming. This was already September-ish, October-ish, sometime around then. This area is still quite pretty, but not as dramatic as some of the sites we had further south. Just to give you an idea, still good weather. As we get closer and closer to Lyon, it becomes more and more industrial. This is industrial plants on the outskirts of Lyon, and the weather starts to get cooler and cooler. Fog starts to become a real problem. Navigating on the canal in fog is hell, and you just don't want to do it. In fact, I don't know, I thought it was illegal at the time. I thought you had to stop. But we did manage. It never actually stopped us, but it was quite a challenging experience. Okay, we'd arrived back in Lyon. I went to the shipping agent and he said, how big did you say your boat was? I said, 43 feet. Oh, he said, it's 1 foot or 6 inches or something. I don't know exactly how much. Too big to fit in a container. We're in trouble. What are we going to do? He said, don't worry, I'll work it out for you. So we went, the day later, we went back to talk to him, and he said, we've solved the problem. You're going to take the boat to Calais on the west coast, the northwest coast of France. To Calais? How on earth are we supposed to get to Calais? It's not only a long way, but the canals are closing for the winter. We can't even get there. He said, no worries. you'll take the boat down to Valence, and at Valence, we'll lift the boat out of the water, put it on a truck, and you'll drive across France to Calais with the boat in a truck. All at their expense, I should say. This didn't cost us anything. I'll tell you more about that part of the adventure in a moment. So off we went downriver to Valence. On the way, we passed the vineyards of Job Boulet, famous Hermitage vineyards. As you can see, I think the harvest had already well and properly over. The grapes were, it was sort of winterish already. And here's what it looked like, the port in Valence, as they called it, the last port before the sea. So you can sail your boat all the way up here from the Mediterranean. You can actually get there under sail. Okay, so now this big truck arrives, and it arrives with our mast. It's coming up from set. How are they able to get such a big truck at such short notice? There's quite a lot of heavy movement of boats, large boats, from the Mediterranean to Lake Geneva, going north in the summer and south in the winter. And so these trucks do a useful trade, moving large boats from Lac Léman to the Mediterranean. This was the end of the season, so this particular truck was looking for work anyhow. So he had just taken a boat from the north to the south, and he was told to pick up our mast, which had been stored in Sète, bring it up to Valence, and he had been contracted to carry our boat, all the Happy Prince, all the way across France to the northwest corner of France, Calais. So here you can see them efficiently lifting the boat out of the water. I should point out here, it's hard to see, but at this point here, there's a little, looks small, notch in our lead keel. It was about 3 or 4 inches deep, that's all, and it was just solid lead here. That was caused by me not paying attention at one spot somewhere, I don't exactly remember where, on the river, and hitting a rock at 5 knots. We hit it so hard that people were thrown forward on the boat. Nobody got hurt, and this was the first time I saw the extent of the damage. To be honest, I was surprised at how little damage there actually was. And here's the boat on our big truck, ready to cross France. The deal was that I was to drive a small Renault 4, a Renault 4, in front of the truck, 200 meters ahead, with a big sign, and he was to follow me. He was to give me instructions in French, and my French was middling, not great, but not fluent by far. And he would give me instructions on where to go, and I would follow his instructions, and I'd have to stay 200 meters ahead of him with this big sign on the top of my car. This trip was going to take us 3 days. In those days, he was restricted to small country roads. He was not allowed to travel on highways or superhighways or auto routes. He had a huge book that gave him his route across France, and he was not allowed to travel in the night, and he was not allowed to travel in fog. And he wasn't allowed to stop anywhere except for assigned spots. So, you know, a few times we got caught in the night or caught in fog, and he wasn't allowed to stop and he wasn't allowed to go. So I'm not sure this seemed to be a particularly French situation. Anyhow, we did get across France without too many problems. It was an adventure on its own. I don't really want to go into that. I didn't have a camera with me, so I couldn't take any shots. but it was quite the adventure on its own. So after a few adventures on the way, particularly in Calais itself, where as we crossed it was the only significant city that we actually had to cross. And we were supposed to be met by a motorbike escort of gendarmes to cross the city, and it was getting late and they weren't there. So he said, well, we've got no choice. We're going to have to cross the city without an escort. So we sort of made it quite successfully to the very center of the city, to a big roundabout with many roads coming in from all different directions. And he was lost. He could not find which road to take out. And we couldn't stop. So we were going around and around this large roundabout while he was presumably fumbling his book, trying to work out which exit he should take. Eventually he found the right exit, but I think we went around 4 or 5 times, me trying to stay 200 meters ahead of him. But eventually he did get us to Calais. And our adventure wasn't ended yet, because in Calais, the truck drove up to this big crane here, huge crane. They put a sling under the boat and started to lift it. The boat had lifted about no more than a few inches when it fell back straight down again. And the French said to us, "C'est trop lourd, it's too heavy." I said, now's a nice time to find out that it's too heavy. Fortunately, it dropped right back into its sling, into its supports. It was only an inch or two out, and there was no damage done. I just wondered what would have happened if it would have gone a bit further. Anyhow, they brought another crane up that without difficulty lifted the boat and put it. It was actually interesting the way they actually built a frame for the boat. The crane supported the boat with the keel just touching some 2x4s on the ground, laid flat, and they got a whole pile of 2x4s and pushed them laterally against the hull in 2 spots, and literally on the spot built a very solid frame for the boat. They actually built it on the spot, and it must have been good, because they used that to put it onto a roll-on, roll-off, and it went onto a big freighter, crossed the Atlantic, and ended up in Baltimore. We obviously did not go with the boat. We traveled independently, and 6 weeks later or so, we were told, come back to Baltimore, come down to Baltimore to move the boat to Annapolis, where the boat was supposed to have, from where it was supposed to be sold. So it was Christmas time when we came to Baltimore, and some of you know that the distance from Baltimore to Annapolis is not very far. It's 4 or 5 miles, I think that's all. It's, by sea, it's quite close. The deal was that as long as the boat was on the dock in Baltimore, where it had been stored, still on the frame that had been built in France, that was okay, that we could leave it there almost indefinitely. But once the boat was lifted in the water, we had to get it out of there. We were not allowed to stay in the commercial dock area in Baltimore in a recreational boat like ours. So the deal was, they'll put it in the water, they'll put the mast laying down on top of the boat. A friend came to help me, actually the agent who was selling the boat, and so we'll start up the motor and off we'll go. And that's more or less what happened. Except we'd only gone about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, maybe a mile offshore, and the Coast Guard came by. And they said, "Where are you going?" And we said, "Well, we're going to Annapolis." And they said, "We don't think so. Chesapeake Bay is covered in ice. I'm not sure you'll get through." Well, they said there's a very small port you can go to, which we know you could overnight if need be, but we decided to give it a try. And we sailed out into the Chesapeake Bay, and sure enough, we could see the ice covering the bay, but we also saw there were oyster boats in the middle of the ice working. And we got up close to them, and they could obviously break the ice. They were fairly solid boats, and they knew what they were doing. So we asked them whether they would break a channel through the ice that we could follow, and they agreed to do that. So we followed them for a couple of miles and eventually arrived in Annapolis. And you can see here pushing ice off in front of us, even into Annapolis. So that was the second last act of the day of the trip. And the last grand final, as it were, grand finale, was when we sold the boat in the spring, the following spring. We drove down to Baltimore to show the new owners how to sail the boat. And why I put this photo in particular, although the boat, we used the boat all the time as a sloop, it was actually cutter rigged. And it was just the only time where we actually flew the staysail, which you can see here. And it was actually out in Chesapeake Bay. It was one of the best sails we'd had on the boat. And unfortunately, it was the last sail for the Happy Prince and us together. So that's it, folks. I think I've done my time. So there you go. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your talk. And every once in a while, I hear another voice in the background. So perhaps you can thank Fran as well. So I think now we're going to go on with some questions, and I'll see if we have any right now. But while we're waiting, Paul, you talked about running into a time as you crossed the Atlantic when there was very little wind. And I've always heard from years ago about the Sargasso Sea, whether or not you were ever in it or on the side of it. Is that the reason that you ran into doldrums?
Okay, you reminded me of two things, Park, that I forgot to mention. In answer to your question, we went right through the middle of the Sargasso Sea, that area, and the doldrums, as they're called. But the thing that really surprised me was jellyfish. I was going to look them up on Google. I forgot to look them up again. The locals called them Portuguese man of war, but it's not what we knew as Portuguese man of war in Australia. Anyhow, they were small. They were about 3 inches, 4 inches in size. And they had a little sail, like a wind vane on top, which apparently they could raise and lower. And they were reasonably colorful.
I think you called them blue bottles.
Well, we knew blue bottles in Australia too, and that's not what they were. So it's all a bit of confusion. Maybe, I'm not sure what they were. Anyhow, they were every couple of meters on the way across from Bermuda all the way to Portugal. You could, at any minute, you could see hundreds of them around the boat. They were quite dramatic. And of course, you could also, when the guys I was with tried to fish, they couldn't get a line overboard before it snagged on Sargasso. So we never caught any fish all the way across. Yeah.
What a shame. The other thing I was thinking about is we're used to red right returning in Canada and the States. And I believe perhaps the same as in Australia. In England, it's the other way around. It's red left returning. And
Right.
I believe it is that way the whole of Europe as well, is it not?
And in the Azores. So Bermuda is red right returning. The Azores is red left returning. So once we hit the Azores, it was red left returning. Although in the days we were there, the Azores was so disorganized that I don't think it was any side returning.
I see. So but you basically get used to that then, going up and down the canals in Europe, red left returning.
Yeah.
You have no idea whether that's a legacy of the British or something, of the British Navy, do you? Or where did,
No idea. No
why
idea.
in the world did we change, or why did they, why?
No idea. Google it, Park. Google it.
Okay, I'll have to Google it, I guess, and see what is going on. See if there's any other open questions now. I was thinking as you showed that little notch just in the keel, that you could have told us that that was put in a full keel boat by the manufacturers so that the straps, the lifting straps, would have some place to better hold the boat. And we might have believed.
No, we hit that rock in the middle. I can't exactly remember where we were, but I just wasn't paying attention. And we hit that rock with a real bang. And I thought, my God, I'll rip the keel right off this boat. And there's no water in the boat. Everything seems fine. Somebody was down below decks, got thrown against something or other and mildly hurt, but nothing serious. And I was very surprised when the boat was lifted out to see how little damage it had actually caused.
Very good.
Yeah.
So, well, I'll see if we have a question coming in. And actually, it's not so much a question as a thanks to you for giving this talk and sharing the adventure. So from a chap named JP Melanson. So we have a question about how long was the entire trip? So
okay. Yeah, I didn't talk much about time. It took us 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. That means from Cape Coral to Seville. We stopped 3 days in Bermuda and 3 days in the Azores. 26 days was the longest from Bermuda to the Azores. I think it was 26 days.
I see. That's still a long time without seeing any land.
Sorry?
Long time without seeing land.
Yeah, not only not seeing land, but it's amazing how little you see of anything in the Atlantic in those latitudes. On average, we would see one ship every other day on the horizon. We never saw a ship during the day, ever.
Wow.
In the night, because you could see much further, you'd see the lights. And we had VHF, and we could talk to them on VHF, but that's it. We couldn't talk any further. And we were right out in the middle of the Atlantic when the Tiananmen Square crisis was taking place. So we could listen to the BBC and hear what was going on, but there was nothing much we could have done with it. And if we would have got into trouble and needed to communicate, we had the SARSAT system at that time. That was the only way we had of communicating with the outside world when we were at sea, further than 10 miles from anywhere else. The other thing worth mentioning is whenever we saw a ship, if we could communicate with them, we asked them what the weather forecast was. And after a while, we said, why are we asking them what the weather forecast is? What difference does it make? There's nothing we could do to get out of the way of a storm that's coming anyhow. So we stopped asking. But in the event, as I said, our biggest challenge was lack of wind, not too much wind.
You didn't say about the dolphins.
Yeah, we saw dolphins. They were the only significant dolphins and flying fish. Every morning there'd be flying fish, a few ones on the boat, dead. but they were the only fish we saw, and dolphins.
If we have a question here from Advantage Boating, and they've arranged, of course, a number of charters in various spots. There's a question, would you choose a similar boat if you're going to do the same sort of trip today, go from Florida to Europe to one of the spots?
Yes, we were very happy with the boat. I think the idea of a center cockpit, but not a high center cockpit, is excellent. And it was a very, very comfortable boat. Of course, I've only chartered, 7 or 8 times various boats, always aft cockpit boats. This is the only time I've ever been in a center cockpit boat. And it was very, very practical. Yes, I'd do it again in that boat. Yeah.
Okay. Of all the places, all the cities, all the towns, various historic sites you went through, is there one particular place that sort of stands out in your mind as sort of like the highlight of the trip?
I wouldn't say so. Lyon was terrific because we were so much in the center of Lyon. We could just step out of the boat and we were right next to some of the most expensive apartments in Lyon. That was I found that quite dramatic, and the market there was, I'll tell you one thing, sailing across the Atlantic is boring. Sailing, I mean, ultimately it's boring. Motoring up the canals is fascinating. There's always something going on. There's always something to see. So for a while we had ambitions to do it again. I'm not sure you could do that today. I don't think it would be quite the same today. It's become much more recreational boating. I'm not sure it would be practical today.
Right. Can you talk about the crew you had on board? You changed crew between the time you crossed the Atlantic and then the time you're in the canals itself. I guess maybe there is family in the canals, so you're going to have to be very careful. When I decided I wanted to do this trip, and we started looking for a boat, and we were traveling all over North America looking for a reasonable boat. Fran, my wife, said, "There's no way I'm going to sail across the Atlantic." So, and the kids were obviously far too young in those days. Anyhow, that wasn't even thought about. So I started to look around for people who would join me, and I put the word out at the P and Sailing Club. And, you know, it's very embarrassing, but I can't remember the name of the 2 guys. One's first name was Derek, and the other one was Dave, and I do not remember their second names. There may be somebody listening today who can remember them. Derek was a policeman.
Cooper.
No,
There was a Cooper.
No, the third guy was Mike Cooper. Mike Cooper had never sailed before. He was a guy we had met. He was a teacher and a very, very nice guy, and expressed some real interest. He'd never sailed, but he was a very laid back, easygoing guy. And I thought, we're going to have 4 and then 3 guys on the boat. You want to make sure that one of them at least is very laid back and very easygoing. And that's more or less what happened. We all got on very well together. There wasn't any problem. Derek, the policeman he was a Newfoundlander. He only agreed to come as far as Bermuda. And he was the guy who, when we got on the first night, we were out in the Gulf of Mexico. It was dead calm, and we could see crab pots all over the place. And he said, "Let's drag up one of the crab pots." And we said, "Oh, can't be. That may belong to somebody." And this policeman said, "Forget it." He just dragged one up, and he was the only one amongst us who knew how to cook crabs anyhow. So the first night out, we had a whole lovely pot of crabs, compliments of the policeman. So they were the people I went across with anyhow. And the other two, Mike and Dave, had always been, that was the agreement. They flew out from Seville, and in Seville, Fran and Davina and Judy, my daughters, joined us, and for most of the rest of the trip. The end of the trip was just Fran and me. And on the way, we had a few friends join us at various times. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think the last question we have here, and excuse me, the cost to use the locks in France, but the thing is that's 30 years ago, so it may not have anything to do with what you might find today.
Yeah. None of the costs that we had would have anything to do with what's going on today. I don't think we ever paid for a lock. I don't remember. If we did, it must have been peanuts. But most of the time, many of the locks were self-operated. There was not even a lock keeper. You pulled a cord, or you went out and waved something metal, because some of them were activated by a metal detector, because the barge would just come up. They were all metal. We didn't have enough metal on the boat, so you had to creep out with a saucepan and wave it in front of the metal detector. Some of them had lock keepers. You would have a conversation, maybe give them a tip. That was all. I don't think we ever paid. And as far as mooring, I think we might have paid for docking in Valence and the ports, but even that, I'm not sure. Couldn't have been much. We couldn't have afforded much. Yeah.
Sounds a bit like Canada, because at that point in the Trent Severn system and in the Rideau system, the locks were all free. But that certainly changed since that sort of time frame. So no more questions, I see. So I want to thank you very much, Paul, for coming and talking to us here tonight. And I guess we have a tradition to thank the people with something a little more tangible. You saw this earlier. I can do it properly this time. Nepean sailing cap, that's a ball cap. Or if you want something more apropos for the winter, let's see, there we go. There we go, Nepean Sailing Club. And that's a toque. And so they will be available. Jamie has some in the front office. If you'd like to either phone her or email her, she can make arrangements for you to come and pick one up. And so I appreciate you coming here tonight, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed it.
We did. I learned quite a bit. So turning now again for a moment to next week. Remember, next week we're going to have a talk by Vicki Hogan-Gow on keeping your sails young and good care and maintenance of your sails. So that's coming up for next week. And see you all next week again. Stay safe and stay well. Good night.